All right, well, leaders, welcome back. Lesson 8. And after having about 8 chapters or so on the tabernacle, I was grateful for a little bit of a tighter unit to look at here as we jump into Exodus 32 to 34. And so let's kind of reset kind of where we've been in the flow of the story. And so really, of course, last week, all those chapters on the tabernacle. But before that, as we walked out of the Red Sea, we got into, in a sense, the Mosaic covenant. And so God and his people were, in a sense, marriage ceremony moment. And then they're kind of thinking about their life together and how they're going to live together. And then we hit this chapter, or these set of chapters, and really kind of what's going on. And so I was thinking, in a sense, this is kind of their first marital fight. And I thought it was really, really funny. I was thinking of funny analogies. And then we talked, and you had thinking what this chapter was not just a marital fight, but was...
Yeah, actually, if it could be considered maybe committing adultery on the wedding night.
A little more dramatic.
Yeah.
But actually probably a little more fitting for what actually ends up unfolding here. And so huge section, huge important section, kind of in the flow of the book. And so excited to kind of walk through that with you guys today. So kind of give us big themes, big ideas as we're kind of looking at the observation section.
Yeah, so again, we have our 6 questions. So we're taking this chunk of scripture and we're just asking these kind of big who, what, when, where, and why questions. And so we typically have a tendency to do kind of focus on the what and the big ideas, the events, the themes. And so a couple that I saw were fidelity. So what is it like? And then what is it not like? And the other is friendship. So friendship with God. I was really struck by how Moses, think how far he's come from when he was in this exact same location at the very beginning of the story, or near the beginning, when he was fear and trembling before the burning bush and saying, no, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And now he is dealing with God at a different level of maturity, of friendship. It even says in 33 verse 11 that God spoke to him as a friend face to face. And so, friendship and fidelity.
One of the questions I loved is question 5. And so one of the reasons why we were excited about Exodus is you get a chance to kind of look at literature or narrative. And so particularly here thinking of the plot line. So kind of what does this section do in terms of our plot line? So if you kind of think through where we've been throughout the slavery, we're building in tension that's rising until you kind of hit the climax. And so when God ushers Israel out of Egypt and through the Red Sea, you kind of have this climactic moment, this, you could picture it for movies. And then we're kind of now working on the backside of that climax and towards resolution. And so really what this section for me does is remind me, as we're working toward resolution, it's a very up and down kind of deal. It doesn't just flatten out in only one direction, but good stories are going to have some challenges and wrinkles as it kind of works its way out. And that's kind of what we see in this section.
Yeah, for sure. And also in question 5, too, I think, why is it included? Because it also continues to widen the lens and give, or maybe even deepen the understanding of the character of God, what he's actually like. We really see him in a very personal way. And then what the character of people are like. So 4 times in this section, the people of Israel are called stiff-necked. And so, and then there's also descriptions of what God is like, angry, but also loving and compassionate. So just the continuing character development.
On the additional observation questions on question 1, I think if you kind of narrowly think about it from shine or radiate, you're going to kind of zone in on God's glory, Moses' face. If you broaden that and kind of think about it more just what's flashy, I think you can pull in a sense, the jewelry that becomes the golden calf itself, even the fire that's going to melt and then form the golden calf, and then in a sense destroy the golden calf as well. That those things all kind of broaden in terms of what could be flashy or what's kind of bright and ultimately radiating. In terms of the consequences that Israel will face as a result of their idolatry, I think it's a great question. I think you could even divide up your group into sections and let them take some of the, half a chapter each and kind of go, what emerges out of here? Obviously, God's anger is kindled in terms of against Israel. The tablets become destroyed initially as Moses comes down, which becomes, in a sense, a symbol of the covenant that was made has now been broken. Moses is going to burn the golden calf in fire and then throw that powder into water and force Israel to drink it, which is That's dramatic.
Yeah.
Also, you're going to have, according to chapter 32, verse 28, 3,000 men will initially be killed as God responds and as his anger goes out. Chapter 32, verse 35 mentions that the Lord smites the people. We know from even in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 8 and 9, another 23,000 of Israel will be killed on this day. So it wasn't just the 3,000. We get other narrative details that show even more were killed. There were 600,000 men in total, though. So it's still, it's not nothing, but it's definitely not, it's still pretty small in some regards. And then lastly, one of the things that we kind of laughed about was at the very beginning of chapter 32, as God's relaying to Moses, in a sense, what's unfolded while he's been up and away. He begins to change the pronouns by which he talks about the people of Israel. And so particularly he says to Moses, go down at once for your people whom you brought up from the land of Egypt. And so God's not claiming them as his own. And so as the covenant's been broken, he's distancing himself. And so maybe it was just my upbringing as an only child, but when I messed up, my parents would argue regarding me, and they would use pronouns about me being their other child, or like they weren't claiming
your
me.
son.
Yes,
did
exactly.
This. Yeah.
And so it reminded me of that moment, and we'll get some counseling later. But ultimately, God is, in a sense, distancing himself and disowning them in a sense because the covenant's been broken.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then question 3, we've said this before, but it's worth repeating. You as a leader should really be thinking about extra questions that your group might be relevant to. We've only got 5 questions that cover a lot of really interesting and important details, but there may be more, and there may be some that you have, there may be some that your group has. So be thinking of that ahead of time, maybe jotting down a couple that you think are relevant that you would want to add in to what we're going to talk about now.
So in terms of interpretation, 3 significant chapters, we have 5 questions. And so there's much more ground to be tilled and kind of areas to explore if you're going to kind of come up with those questions. But really questions 1 and 2 really are the bulk of where you're going to want to spend a little bit of time. And so Carolyn, kind of walk us through kind of what you saw and what's kind of going on here as the section opens.
Yeah. So this first question is a bit, asking the why. The scripture is interesting because it doesn't exactly say why the Israelites asked Aaron to do this, but we can kind of gather from what is going on here maybe a few things. So they actually come up around him, but one translation or one way of looking at it is they kind of came up against him. So as Moses is gone, Aaron's left there, the people are left there, and so they may have been feeling directionless, fearful, impatient. Even they say this fellow Moses. So they may have thought that he's out of here. They don't see him, and so there's maybe a disrespect for Moses's leadership, wanting something. At the bottom line, I think it's wanting something tangible and present, because Moses is absent and God is not tangible.
And some commentaries will go so far as to say that they may have presumed that Moses had been killed, that he had died in the presence of God. And so now they don't have their mediator. God is silent and absent, and so even more they are feeling lost and adrift in a sense.
Yeah. And so what they're wanting is what the gods of their cultural in the Near East provide, which is basically protection and provision. Another way of saying it is security and significance, that by having this leadership and this God that they can see, that it provides something that they're lacking. What's really interesting about it is that in 32 verse 4, it's when Aaron builds the calf, he says, "This is the God that brought you out of Egypt," which is a direct parody, a grotesque parody, if you will, of what it says in 20 verse 2, where it says Yahweh is the one who brought you out of Egypt. So they're replacing God.
The timing of the struggle reminds me a little bit of even as Israel comes out of the Red Sea and they have this huge water miracle, and then they have some water troubles, like 3 verses out of the Red Sea and into the wilderness, and they panic. We just spent eight chapters in which God was highlighting for the nation of Israel how he was going to be present with them. And now all of a sudden we're 3 verses into the next section and they're wondering and fearful about his presence. And so they quickly revert, in a sense, to an old way of finding the presence of a God. And so some commentators will talk about the calf was, in a sense, known as the pedestal of God, or could have been seen as a vehicle upon which God rode in power. And so this was a way of either summoning God or, in a sense, a way for them to represent their God in a familiar way. And even some of the ways that they respond to serve and worship that God also highlight in verse, it's when it talks about how they ate, drank, and played. Likely that had some sense of sexual immorality. So they're reverting back to old patterns that were not at all what God had called them to and what God was laying out for how he was going to be present with them and how they were going to worship him.
Yeah, and so then question 2 is referring back to the 10 Commandments in chapter 20. And so that might be something to go ahead and read those verses or ask someone in your group to read those and just talk about the significance and the distinction between Commandment 1 and Commandment 2. And then how this scene, the Israelites are directly disobeying it. And so, of course, Commandment 1 is have no other gods before me. So that means to not worship, serve, or trust in a power that is other than Yahweh. And so by demanding Aaron to make them a god, they are, in a sense, breaking this first commandment. And then as he does it, he's breaking commandment number 2, which is to not make an idol. So no man-made thing that can represent God should be made, because that would be perpetuating a lie that there are false gods that are here and we can make them out of our own hands. So they're replacing and they're remaking God. I think what's interesting, too, is that, in a sense, they've also broken the third commandment, which is to not take the name of the Lord in vain. Because we see here in verse 5 of 32 that Aaron says that this is... when he makes the calf, he says, "This is your God, Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and they will do a festival. Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord, to Yahweh." So he's associating this idol with the name of Yahweh. So he's taking God's name in vain, in a sense, by bringing this idolatrous act together with God's name.
I think part of what I love in narratives is the rawness with which you get some of the dialogue. And so one of my favorite parts is when Moses comes to Aaron and confronts him, and Aaron's like it just came out as a calf, like as if there wasn't some intentional plan to form and to create shape for the way that the gold would have been melted. And so you see Aaron both passive as a leader, in a sense, jettisoning what was most significant and important and quickly folding even in Moses' absence, and then not owning it at all and not owning his role in it, not owning, in a sense, how he led them down this path and made and enabled it as well. And so you have a huge error on the nation of Israel's side. You have a huge error on Aaron's side. And so Moses coming down, confronting all these pieces, that becomes incredibly difficult and significant. I think one of the things we loved is on the dark side, on the bad side, you kind of see, in a sense, how Israel's responding here. But on the positive side, watching Moses's interaction with the Lord. Yes, and I appreciated you took us all the way back to the beginning, thinking about where he was, because his interactions here and the role that he serves as a mediator is a tricky dance, but he does it incredibly well. And so you have a couple different interactions. First, in chapter 32, when God is communicating, so we're now kind of in question 3 in terms of what do you see about Moses' appeal and an interaction with God in these scenes. And so, in a sense, as God says he's going to destroy Israel, you see, in a sense, Moses interceding on Israel's behalf and even pushing back and leading up, maybe one could say, on the Lord, and particularly appeals in a couple different ways. First starts off with appealing to, if God were to destroy Israel, then what would Egypt say? What would the other nations say? That he's appealing, in a sense, initially to God's own glory and reputation that drives the whole thing anyways. Secondly, he appeals then to the unconditional covenants that God gave to Abraham. And so, yes, the commandments or the covenant that God made with the nation of Israel was conditional, that if they obeyed, he would bless them. If they disobeyed, he would curse them. But underneath all that, though, was still a framework and a base foundation for an unconditional commitment that God had made to his people, to the descendants of Abraham, that God could not cross. And so Moses is reminding God of that, not as if God had forgotten it, but to say that it's not congruent. Those kinds of actions wouldn't be congruent with the unconditional promises you made. And then lastly, in what you're going to see, particularly as God will eventually renew the covenant and call them to enter the promised land, is Moses is going to appeal back to the promise that God made as to his presence going with his people. And then Moses is going to say, I don't want to lead this people, and this people isn't going to fare well unless you are present with them, which is where the whole thing began and the problem we got to in the beginning. And so he's pleading with the presence of God, for God to be present and for him to move with his people. And then lastly, you're going to see that as the mediator, he doesn't just appeal in those ways, but he ultimately will make an atonement for the sins of Israel as well. And so Moses' role as a mediator in this section is fascinating and significant. And particularly one of the things I love is that even in the absence or the vacuum that the nation of Israel feels, a leader at times can try to draw the attention to themselves, but this particular mediator will be, I think, incredibly disciplined to draw the attention to where it should be, not upon a leader who could, in a sense, salve some of that wound, but draws it to where it's ultimately meant to be satisfied. So,
Yeah. So then question 4 gets really at what I think is one of the big themes is just the nature and character of God. How are we seeing it even more on display as he renews the covenant, as he offers forgiveness? I think for chapter 34, verses 6 and 7 is really crucial. It's this iconic description of who God is and what he's like. And so actually, I think having someone again read that section and then just have people, if I were leading, just ask, what do we see in verse 6? What is his character described like? So he's compassionate, he's gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And then in 7, what are the actions that we see God taking? He's maintaining love to thousands. And actually, that's probably thousands of generations, because the generational language that follows that is probably not thousands of people, but thousands of generations. So he's maintaining his love to thousands of generations, forgiving in this comprehensive way. And then he's also exhibiting just judgment and punishment for the guilty. And so what we have here is what we see God is like throughout the biblical narrative, is that he's this both and. It's this paradox, if you will, two true things sitting side by side, that God is both compassionate and just. And that he won't let the guilty go unpunished. It wouldn't be loving and merciful to do that. And so, I think you could spend time here. And to me, once again, we see God as this God of restoration. He ultimately wants to dwell with his people. And so in this renewal, we see him doing that again.
I think as you kind of see the compassion and justice kind of held together, I think you see that their error, the nation of Israel's error, caused a break of the fellowship with the Lord. But ultimately, the relationship was never terminated. Mm-hmm. And so part of what, and as we get into question 5, part of what we are seeing Moses as a mediator do is help bring about that restoration and a relationship that wasn't terminated, but the fellowship was broken. Yeah. And so how do we get back to be kind of on the same page? If this was a marriage and there's infidelity, then how do we get back to a restoration of what it was beforehand? And so as you kind of get to question 5, clearly, if 8 chapters before this was about the tabernacle and how God would be present, and then they're fearing that God is absent. And so as we kind of get into this story, what we're going to see is that Moses as the mediator will have physical changes that will authenticate and validate to the nation that God is present with them. So as Moses goes into the presence of the Lord, his glory is going to pass by as he interacts and has interactions with the Lord. The glory of the Lord will literally radiate upon the face of Moses, and Moses will have to wear a veil to buffer it, but also to kind of hide that it's fading between interactions. And so part of what you have here is, again, Moses as the mediator Moses asks for a sign from God, and then Moses becomes a sign from God for the people. So you kind of get this fascinating dialogue and interactions. We kind of go to the end of 34, in which Israel is seeing that God is present with our mediator. He's present with us. in terms of the promised land and the enemies that are before us, that God will be present with us as he fulfills his promises to us.
Yeah. And of course, you can't help but think, as Paul brings up in 2 Corinthians 3, that this is what happens to us too when we're in the presence of God. The promise and the hope is that we will change, that our faces, our demeanor, our actions will become radiant in a sense, that we will reflect the glory of God. We will become like Jesus, the image of God. And so, if you wanted to even pull out 2 Corinthians 3:18, we with unveiled faces, looking in a mirror at the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord and from the Spirit. So Moses' glory was temporary, but ours in Christ is not fading, and it's eternal. It's really beautiful.
To kind of get into application in this last set of sections, as we kind of think about how do we apply and engage with what we've learned. The first couple questions there for reflection are probably our favorite. So clearly, this is a section about idolatry, and kind of how do the people of God respond or struggle when it feels like God is silent or absent. And so it's easy for many of us in the midst of suffering or circumstances to feel like God is absent or that he's silent sometimes when we're praying for things. And so I think giving your group a chance to kind of wrestle through what's either practically going on now, or what are been some areas or seasons of life where it's felt that their circumstances were similar to where Israel was. And so I love the beauty of narratives, whether Old Testament or the Gospels, because we see kind of the human condition and we see how easy it is to struggle. It's easy to resonate with, okay, I'm not alone in these things. And so give your group a chance to kind of wrestle with what have been those circumstantial similarities that maybe we can connect with. And then from there, particularly, why is it we run to other things? What is it we're looking for? And so we kind of hit those ideas or themes that God provides protection and provision, or security and satisfaction. And so when those things are threatened, what are the ulterior things or the alternates that we run to instead of the Lord to provide those things that only the Lord can? And so it seems that at times put us in a loop of momentary stability, but not ultimate stability or significance and provision. So kind of what are those things for each person? And ultimately creates an area and a space for some vulnerability and confession that we want to give space for.
Yeah. And then question 2, if we had idolatry in 1, we have intercession in question 2 here. And just the power. I mean, again, that was what struck me as I was going through this lesson again. Just the actual bold intercession that Moses, projected to the Lord, that he wasn't afraid to ask for these seemingly impossible things. And so just a reminder to be praying big, for the things, for the people around us as an intercessor. As intercessors, people who are far from God, people that we know that are struggling. I just think that would be a great thing to talk about in your group one more time. Yeah, and so then the last thing we have is our spiritual practice about confession. And clearly the Israelites, needed to, be restored to God after their great break with him. And so we too need to take time in our lives. And so this practice just is a suggestion for a way to reflect and then confess. And so we just suggested here that to have people get aside, in the coming week, and just, ask the Lord, ask the Spirit to reveal what are some of the blatant areas of sin where I have, maybe as in question 1, run to an idol instead of to God. And are there times when we've stepped out of walking in the Spirit, or times of anger or thoughtlessness? And not only those inner or sort of just one-off acts, but maybe what are some of the tendencies that those things kind of are the surface to something below. So for self-preservation or self-promotion or self-sufficiency. And then to be thinking, have we offended or hurt anyone else? So all these little areas that we have in the reflection are just bringing up and reflecting and spending some time to think of how we might be restored to the Lord. And then taking those things to him. And what confession is basically is agreeing with God, saying, yes, I confess this is wrong. And then asking for forgiveness and knowing and trusting that God is willing, able, and ready to forgive us. And then if there is anything that we have in our relational area with people, friends that we've hurt perhaps, to ask their forgiveness as well. So yeah, we hope that this would be just a good reminder for people who have understood confession before, but maybe it's new for some of the people in your group who really don't know, how do I get back into fellowship with God and with other people? So this is a practice for that.
Encourage you guys as leaders as well. Sometimes it's just easy to stick with the academic and what are we learning, and to not to miss some of these skills. But in particular, I think some of these skills also kind of get into areas that maybe we're not as good at. And so, it's easy to think, oh, they've committed massive idolatry, they should think about confession. But ultimately, part what we're trying to draw to is just there should be some rhythms that are natural and consistent in our lives, whether there's massive sins or whether there's kind of smaller ones, that there's an attitude and a perspective of openness to the Lord to kind of reveal those things, and that we're attentive to those on a daily basis. So.
Yeah. Okay, that's all we have for you guys. We're really praying for you, and one more lesson to go next time.
See ya.